turnout. So I've got 7 on 2 or something, so we're just going to go ahead and start. Yeah, yeah. Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here in about a minute or so. I know there's some students outside waiting to come in. But my name is James McLeod. I'm the chair of the Department of History, Politics and Social Change at the University of Evansville. And believe me when I say that we are extremely happy to welcome you all here tonight. This is the first Fiddick lecture for 2 years, and tonight's speaker was due to be here 1 year ago tonight, but she's here tonight. So there's also a whole bunch of people who are going to be watching this on a live stream, and those of you at home and all of you here, I think you can start by giving yourselves a round of applause for being here. I'm also very aware that there's other things going on in Evansville tonight, and I just wanted to make sure right off the bat that you'd all come to the right place. If this is the stuff you want, that's the Ford Center downtown. And actually, Dr. Wagner is staying at the DoubleTree, and she just thought everybody in Evansville looked like that. So I didn't tell her anything different, so don't tell her that was going on. The first thing that I wanted to do tonight, and really the most important thing, is to talk quickly and get off this stage. But I never want to have this event without saying a few words about Tom Fiddick, the man for whom this lecture series is named. And I think it's a kind of particularly appropriate event this evening when you think about who Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner is. But Tom was many things, and many things to many people in this room. But if you had to boil down Tom Fiddick to just 3 things, I think they would be these. Firstly, Tom was a scholar and a teacher. And that's really how many of you will have known and interacted with Tom Fiddick, a professor and teacher at the U of E from 1963 until 2002, someone who literally touched the lives of thousands and thousands of students as they went through Evansville College as it was then, and laterally the University of Evansville. And I think it's always a really great testament to Tom Fiddick's life and career that his legacy is people who had successful lives in a very wide range of fields, and people from every possible range of political opinion who were influenced by Tom Fiddick. The first thing I'd want you to know about Tom was that he was a scholar. And the second thing I would emphasize about Tom is that he was an activist, someone who fought tirelessly really his whole life for the causes that he believed in. And the cause of social justice and social change, a name that we're very proud to have in our department name now, was very much on Tom's mind. And I think it's kind of funny that we are in a department of history, politics, and social change, 3 things that were very close to the heart of Tom Fiddick. I'm doing research at the moment on Evansville in the 60s, and I keep coming across Tom's name, leading demonstrations or talking at rallies or writing irate letters to the newspaper about the Vietnam War. So he was a scholar and an activist. And maybe most importantly in life, he was a friend and a family person. a wonderful son, husband, father, and grandfather, and a dear friend to countless people who encountered him over the years at the U of E and in his many other interests outside of Evansville. And I can say from the bottom of my heart that it's one of the great joys of my life that I get to be a personal friend of 3 generations of Fiddicks and Hagers who are carrying on Tom's legacy in all sorts of ways. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, but his granddaughter would be here. She's a student at IU. But she's actually in Glasgow at the International Climate Summit, doing her bit to make the world a better place. So the Fiddick legacy continues. And there's a bio of Dr. Wagner in your program there, but it couldn't help striking me as I was thinking about what to say tonight that you could really say 3 things about Sally Roesch Wagner. Number 1, she's a scholar and a teacher and has been an exemplary scholar and teacher in her field of the women's rights movement for over 50 years. And in that time, she herself has touched the lives of thousands of students. And many of her students are now themselves academic leaders in that field. And secondly, Sally too is an activist. She has been an activist in the women's rights movement, and she was an activist in the anti-war movement from the 60s through the 70s up to the present day. Another scholar who put her studies on one side and her lived these studies and lived the life of an activist. And thirdly and lastly, she too is a wonderful, friendly, engaging person. We've had a great privilege of visiting with her over the last 24 hours. And in these conversations, it's clear that she too is a terrific family person, as a daughter and as a mother and grandmother, and somebody who is very deeply rooted in her beloved South Dakota, where she, COVID permitting, has reunions with her family on a regular basis. So I couldn't be happier, and I feel more privileged to ask you to join me in welcoming tonight's 19th Fiddick Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner.
Good evening. I bet there aren't as many interesting people over in the other part of town tonight. I want to tell you that I'm really honored to be here on the land of sovereign native nations. This land holds the cultural DNA and the spirit of the first peoples of this place. And I'm really honored to be here to deliver the Fiddick Lecture. I had a wonderful dinner last night with Edith Fiddick and James and Dan Byrne and Annette Parks, and hearing stories about Tom. And one of the things that I thought about was Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who you're going to hear about tonight. A major figure in the women's suffrage movement, written out of history. But Matilda Jocelyn Gage said at one point, "We are more alive in death than ever we were in life." And I think about that with Tom, someone who has touched so many lives, given so much joy and so much knowledge to so many people. His spirit clearly lives on, and I'm really honored to be here tonight to honor that spirit, which I hope I do. But I gotta warn you, I want to take you through 1,000 years of women's rights on this land, so I hope you have a couple days. Actually, I'm gonna relieve you of that burden. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. But I think I want to start with the words of Abigail Adams. She wrote to her husband, John, when the founding fathers were meeting to plan what this country would be about. And she wrote, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." What was she talking about? Well, the founding fathers were throwing off the governmental system of England, but they were considering and actually ended up adopting the common law that had been recently adopted in England, and it was the Blackstone Code. And under the Blackstone Code of Common Law, once women married, they became dead in the law. They ceased to exist legally. Now, this is way beyond rights. This is personhood. And so when the women's movement emerged 50-some years later in the suffrage movement, as we call it, but it was a women's rights movement, one of the things that they were dealing with, and the biggest issue they had, was not a problem of equality. Equality would be the next step. They were not persons once they married. Now, how did that work? Well, first of all, you had no right to your body. A husband had a right to rape his wife. The argument was this, the legal argument was this: the two became one and the one was the man. And you can't rape yourself, so it's impossible for a husband legally to rape his property, his wife, his other part of himself. And so the rape laws that were written read, rape is an act of unlawful sexual intercourse with someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. And in 1980, when the California state legislature was considering a marital rape law, I remember one of the senators stood up on the floor of the California Senate and he said, "Oh, come on, you guys, if you can't rape your wife, who can you rape?" And the audience exploded, or the Senate exploded in laughter. That was 1980. In 1980, in every state in the Union, a husband had the legal right to rape his wife. The second wave of feminism worked on that, did away with it, and today in most cases it is illegal for a husband to rape his wife. Battery. A husband had the right to beat his wife as long as he did not inflict permanent injury. There was actually, now I want you to get your mind around this because this is a tough one. There is a religious basis for this. If you go back to the Old Testament and you go back to the creation story in the Bible, there are actually two forms, right? The first form, God creates man and woman equally. But that's not the one that got picked up and given credence. The second one was the one that really became the creation story that Christianity followed. And that's the one where God warns, do not eat the apple, do not eat from the tree of knowledge. And Eve listens to the snake, and she takes a bite of the apple, and then she convinces Adam to do the same. And the punishment that God metes out is that women are to give birth in pain and sorrow and to be under the authority of their husbands. And as Elizabeth Cady Stanton pointed out in the next century, suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton pointed out that edict that woman is to be under the authority of man goes all the way through the New Testament. So it's not isolated to the Eve story in the Old Testament. So now think about this logically. If a woman is in a state of disobedience to her husband, let's say he orders her to do something, and she refuses, heaven and hell were very real in the 19th century. So would she go up or would she go down? She was heading straight down, right? And whose fault was it? Was it her fault? No. It wasn't her fault. She's a nonentity. It's her husband's fault because he failed to enforce obedience. So if a husband loved his wife and he wanted her to go to heaven, he enforced that obedience by whatever means were necessary. So battering was part and parcel of women not having a legal identity. It extended to the children that she birthed. A husband is on his deathbed, and he writes his will, and the wife may not know about it. She's pregnant. She's carrying his child. This will be the thing that she will carry as a reminder of this man that she's given her life to and her love. He dies. The will is read. She gives birth to the child. And the husband in the will has given the child to someone else. And that child is ripped out of the mother's arms and given to its rightful owner. And she has absolutely no recourse. We're not talking rights here, are we? We're talking personhood. She has no right to the children that she gives birth to. Economically, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her father was an attorney and a judge, and at that point, attorneys were trained by apprenticing, basically, to other attorneys. And so there were always these young Turks around that were learning the law from her father, and they loved to tease her. She'd gotten a beautiful necklace, I think, for Christmas. And one of the young attorneys in training said, "Elizabeth, why don't you marry me? I like that necklace you're wearing. It will become my property, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take it out, and I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to get a cigar, and your necklace is going to go up in smoke." Now, if you want to train a feminist, that's a pretty good story to do it. And that's one she remembered later as being formative for her. But that's what the situation was. A woman, she said, could be a rich heiress, but once she married, she was penniless, and she could be homeless, because nothing that she brought into the marriage, nothing that she gained during the marriage, she could work, and her husband at the end of the payday, or the end of the week, could go to her employer and say, "I want my wife's wages." And the employer was required to give the wages to the husband, because the wife was a non-entity, remember? I mean, can you imagine living in that kind of a world? Well, for most women, that's what they knew. That was normal, and that was the world that they understood God had created. And so when women began to rise up against that in the 19th century, they were called heretics. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that a woman she harbored battered women in her community in Seneca Falls when she lived there. And she said a woman should be able to leave a loveless and dangerous marriage, but the law would not allow it. And when she demanded that, she was called, a heretic. You're going against the will of God. The two shall become one, and the one is the man. The marriage ceremony, pure property transference. The father, who was the owner of the property, took the property by his arm and walked her down the aisle. She's dressed in white to show that she is undamaged goods. He walks her down the aisle, and the property transference is done from father to husband. The wife is required to use the word, "I will obey you," in the marriage ceremony. The husband does not. Women who said they refused to obey, and there were some, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I see somebody nodding. I think there was somebody in this, even to the point where I was married in the 60s, that was still part of the wedding ceremony. So a wife from the beginning is required to obey her husband. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, women need a quit-claim deed to their bodies, to be able to control their own bodies, to be able to control their lives. So they're fighting for personhood in the 19th century. Voting? Are you kidding me? Non-entities can't vote. And women were non-entities. So the question of voting wasn't even hardly an issue. It was like, first you have to get personhood. But one of the ways in which you get personhood is changing the laws. And so they demanded Married Women Property Acts. They demanded equal pay. They demanded an opening of occupations to women. They demanded a right to their children. They demanded an end to age of consent laws that were actually, how to describe them? They were invitations to rape. There were states in which the age of consent for girls was 7 years old. So if a man raped a 7-year-old, his argument in defense was that it was consensual. She agreed to it. A 7-year-old was said to be able to give their consent. They fought against those laws. They fought for the right to serve on juries. A woman is accused of a crime, and she appears in court in front of a male judge, an all-male jury, and that's justice in the United States. So you see, they're fighting on all fronts at once. They fought for a woman to control her own body. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage said, "We believe in the sacred rights of the unborn, and the most sacred right of all is to be wanted and chosen and welcome into the world. Every child has that right. And the only way we can ensure it is if a woman is the one to make that decision." Elizabeth Cady Stanton was called a free lover, which was the worst thing you could call a woman at that time. It meant she was totally without boundaries. She was, against everything that was holy and good. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, well, if you mean by a free lover, someone who believes that a woman should be free to give her body to the one she loves and no other, in other words, no marital rape, if you believe a woman should be free to birth or not, depending on her judgment, her conscience, and her desire, and if you believe that a woman should be the absolute sovereign of her own body, then I am a free lover. I want to give you a quote from Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And remember, we're talking about, this is 1870, 1880. This is early. Matilda Jocelyn Gage wrote, "My blood always boils at advice from a man in regard to a family. That at least should be the province of woman alone, to say when and how often she chooses to go down into the valley of the shadow of death to give the world another child should be hers alone to say." So you see, in fighting for personhood, they're fighting for all of these issues. The vote? Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And I'm going to keep using those two because I'll bet you don't know about Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Some people do. How many of you have heard about Matilda Jocelyn Gage? Oh, there are a few hands. Thank you, thank you. Well, after you leave here tonight, every one of you will be able to raise your hands. I've been stalking this dead woman for the majority of my life, so you had a severe case of OCD, you got one. Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were the triumvirate of leadership of the National Woman Suffrage Association. This was the progressive organization that was dealing with all the issues that I'm telling you about. And they were the ones who ultimately were calling for a federal amendment to the Constitution. But Stanton and Gage were saying, you know, the vote is not an end in itself. It's simply a tool by which to lift the fourfold oppression of women at the hands of the church, the family, the capitalist, and the state. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage, I want to give you another quote from her, and give me just a minute to find it. She said, "During the ages, no rebellion has been of like importance with that of woman against the tyranny of church and state. None has had its far-reaching effects. We note its beginning. Its progress will overthrow every existing form of these institutions. Its end will be a regenerated world." 1893, Matilda Jocelyn Gage is calling for an end to patriarchy, and she's naming the institutions. In this book, Woman, Church, and State, it's online and searchable. I encourage you to check it out. It's probably the most important document to come out of the 19th century women's movement. In it, she exposes that Catholic priests are sexually abusing children and also women, and now we know she was right, nuns as well as children. She also exposes sex trafficking in the United States, and it's such a clear description of it that my friend Gloria Steinem read it at an anti-trafficking conference, and people said, "When was that in the paper? I missed it." And that's how immediate and present she is in speaking to us today. So, how did they get this vision of transformation when they weren't even people? You don't go from personhood to, through past equality, from having no personhood all the way to transformation without having seen the possibility of it. Well, they saw the possibility of it. It was in their next door neighbors, the Haudenosaunee. The French named them the Iroquois. That may be the name by which you know the Confederacy. But 1,000 years ago, on the shores of Onondaga Lake, 5 initially warring nations came together and formed a confederacy based on peace. It continues today. What did they see with their Haudenosaunee neighbors? Well, first of all, the political system is based on not winner takes all, but consensus. It's based on you don't make a decision until you can get agreement. That can take a long time. But you listen differently. You listen not the way we're trained up to listen to debate, to find out what's wrong with this idea. But you listen rather to find the piece that you can hold on to and build from together. And if you don't have consensus, you go away, you think about it, you come back. Now, this creates a stable political system. You know, our winner takes all. Really, the majority rules. The disadvantage of it is that it creates a very unstable political system, which we all see. You know, it's the winner takes all, and they make change, and the minority works their best to become the majority, and then takes away what the majority did, and it's this kind of leapfrog where it's really hard to make systemic change in that kind of a system. How was the leadership chosen? Well, it's chosen by consensus, but the responsibility for choosing the leaders that will represent each of the clans in council is in the hands of women. The clan mother is responsible for nominating, getting consensus to the person, the man she's nominated, from the women first and then from the whole clan and then the nation. She nominates, she holds in office, and she removes if necessary. 3 rules that the clan mother must follow in the choice of the chief and in keeping the chief in position is that he can't have killed anybody. He can't be a warrior. It's a peace confederacy. If he's a warrior, he has to step down. He cannot have committed a theft. And the third thing is, he cannot have abused a woman. He cannot have abused a woman or a child. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little side story. I've had a heck of a time with the last administration trying to explain to my clan mother friends who said, "Why did you let that man stay in office? We would have removed him in a minute." Today, this is what these women in the 19th century knew. Elizabeth Cady Stanton talks about how the clan mother cuts off the horns of the chief. She loved that phrase. Well, the clan mother actually holds the symbol of the authority of the chief. When the old chief dies, it's given back to her, and she holds that. And then she installs the new chief by placing this symbol on his head. And it's horns, it's deer horns, so it's cut off the horns. She loved that phrase. Matilda Jocelyn Gage said, "Never was civilization higher. Never was justice more perfect." That's the way she described the Haudenosaunee. Women controlled the economy. They were the agriculturalists, and that was, if men wanted to go off to war, they couldn't without the consent of the women. The women controlled that. The women had final say in terms of land. Colonization has changed some of that, but the wonder is that despite the greatest efforts of church and state alike, the boarding school experience, the colonization process, despite that, the women today still nominate, hold in office, and remove, if necessary, the men that represent them. Say the men want to go off to war. Well, the women control the food, these guys are going to have no food, no moccasins. They're not going to get very far without the position of the women. But the other thing is finding an absence of violence against women. And reports that I went through, I tried to go through from the point of contact to find any reports of violence against women. When they happened, dealt with so severely. But the interesting thing is the way in which the white male reporters are reporting it. It's like, this is amazing. They don't violate women, even the ones they've taken captive. You know, in the West, rape is a part of warfare and has been historically. And so to be confronted by men who did not violate women when they had that absolute power over them was, to these white male observers, from the time of contact through the 19th century, was absolutely amazing. So economic authority, a spiritual authority, and this is probably the most important piece of this information. If you think about the absolute essence of survival, it's life, right? I mean, this is so obvious that it's going to just sound stupid. But if life is the most important element, and I think as we're facing the potential that life on this planet will end, we need to start thinking in these really specific terms. If life is the essential, then who creates life? Women and Mother Earth. Women create life, and everything that we need to survive is on Mother Earth. So women have a special sacredness in Haudenosaunee, and I think this may be fairly common. I don't want to get past my area of expertise, but I think this is probably fairly common with Indigenous people. So this was the vision that drove Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that drove Matilda Joslyn Gage, that drove them to see that transformation was possible. Susan B. Anthony had a more pedestrian mind, and she wanted the vote. She said, let's just get the vote. Don't deal with all this other stuff you two are dealing with. Let's just go after getting the vote for women. And she made, with some politics that might be analyzed as a little bit dirty, made an alliance with the more conservative women's rights organization, a merger that actually was a takeover of their way of approaching, and it also brought in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is an organized army of mother love for God, home, and heaven. They wanted to end the use of alcohol in the U.S., make it illegal. They also wanted to end the use of tobacco. But more importantly, they wanted to create a Christian nation. They wanted to put God in the Constitution, prayer in the public schools, and Jesus Christ as the head of government. Matilda Joslyn Gage said, if we lose religious freedom in this country, the foundation that our founding fathers said was essential, if we lose religious freedom in this country, it's not going to matter who votes. You know, first of all, you'll only be able to vote and run for public office if you pledge allegiance to whatever form of Christianity. And let's be serious here. I mean, can everybody who professes to be a Christian agree on anything? You know, that's why there are a whole lot of different denominations. I mean, let's just take the issue of abortion. If we had a Christian nation, would abortion be outlawed? No. A majority of the Protestant denominations say that under certain conditions, abortion is the most moral choice that a woman can make. But the more conservative Catholicism and more evangelical religions believe that it's a sin. So who's going to decide? You know, you run into a lot of problems, but you run into the basic problem that you have destroyed the foundation of a democracy if you create a Christian nation. So Gage ends up trying to stop this merger, and she's unable to, and she drops out of the movement, and she drops out of history as a result. So what happens then in the 20th century? Because what you've got is a movement toward equality, right? Let's get women the right to vote. Let's become equal. That becomes the dominant focus in the early 20th century. Let's get the vote. And by 1920, women have accomplished that. They've accomplished it, unfortunately, by throwing women of color and immigrant women under the bus. They make the argument, finally, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, is they're courting the South, and they make the argument, give women the right to vote because it's a way to maintain white supremacy. And they use the language, white supremacy. Frederick Douglass's widow attends the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention in 1900 when Susan B. Anthony is presiding. She writes a letter to a friend and says, "The colored women do not like Miss Anthony. I sat in that convention and listened to the Southern delegate 3 times call for white supremacy, and nobody stopped her." Give women the right to vote because there are more white women than there are Negroes, men and women, and there are more white native-born women than there are immigrants, men and women. So you got a twofer here, guys. You not only will maintain white supremacy, you'll maintain native-born supremacy. And they allowed the state auxiliaries to work for the vote for white women only, to segregate, and to work for Jim Crow laws, to work for voter suppression laws. And that was the legacy that the women's suffrage movement ultimately left us. They refused to take on any issues of African Americans. And one of the questions that I put to my feminist foremothers is this: if you would have supported Ida B. Wells in her fight against lynching that was common in the South and the North as well, if you had supported Ida B. Wells and fought against lynching, how many lives of African American men and women could you have saved? That blood is on your hands. We have the vote, but we still have to fight for the right to vote because, once again, voter suppression is becoming the wave of the land in all the forms that we know. The gerrymandering, the laws that are being passed, making it harder and harder for people to vote. So, we have personhood in the 19th century, equality in the 20th century, and what do we have in the 21st century? Transformation. Toward the end of the 20th century, not knowing about the earlier work that was done before the vote, we, and I say we because I am a card-carrying member of the Veteran Feminists of America, we're women who were active before 1973. And we didn't know about all this work for reproductive justice, about all this work for equal pay, job equity, violence against women ending. We didn't know about any of that. We reinvented the wheel. But we fought in the same way they were fighting for personhood, on all fronts at once. And the best of us, Flo Kennedy. Anybody know the name Flo Kennedy or remember her? African-American attorney, kick-ass woman from day one. Flo Kennedy said, "We don't want a piece of the pie. The pie is shit. We have to bake a new pie." And I think that vision of transformation without knowing Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's work to end patriarchy. She was calling forth that same spirit, and that's the spirit that we must have for the 21st century. The Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation, which, see, I told you were going to hear about her, and now full disclosure, I'm the founder and the executive director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation in Fayetteville, New York. We purchased, restored her house, and turned it into a Center for Social Justice Dialogue, which you feel such an affinity with your wonderful history department here. You've got great faculty. Part of what I want to do is retire at Syracuse University, my classes there, and come here and study in the history department, because my conversations have taught me so much with these faculty. You're really lucky. And the social justice component is wonderful. The way it's designed, I'm really impressed with. So, I was giving you full disclosure, right? Okay, we've turned it into a Center for Social Justice Dialogue. We had 14 days of Black Lives Matter demonstrations in front of the Gage Center. We had 2 rallies. They were led by African American young women in our community, our small, white, very conservative community. Fayetteville, New York. It's a suburb of Syracuse. But why did we do that? We did that because Black Lives Matter is a feminist issue. Voter suppression is a feminist issue. Anti-Asian hate violence is a feminist issue. Because what we understand, and we have the model of the Haudenosaunee here, the model of Native people, generally the indigenous model that tells us we are all related. You know, I mean, it takes Western science a little bit of time to catch up with indigenous spiritual knowledge, but we're all stardust, right? All life on this planet is made up of the same composition. We are all related. And so that pecking order that we were given of man has dominion over woman and all life, all animals, all, that hierarchical pecking order is taking us to the edge of destruction, because what that says to us is that we can murder entire nations of living beings. We call them species, right? To separate ourselves from them. But we are murdering in 1 minute 3 nations of inhabitants of this planet. 3 a minute. I wrote down, because I couldn't even believe it, 150 species every day, and between 18,000 and 55,000 nations of living beings each year. 55,000. Passenger pigeons. Matilda Jocelyn Gage's son talked about how there were so many passenger pigeons in the sky, he could take a stick and knock them out of the sky, and his mother would bake a passenger pigeon pie. Today, there is not one living passenger pigeon. The only reason there is any buffalo is because there were some native people who saved a few, and the herds are now expanding. 55,000. But you know what? Literally, we are all related. The bees are in trouble. 80 to 90% of the food we eat is pollinated by bees. We lose the bees, we lose us. It's no longer appropriate to talk about climate change. It's climate catastrophe, and it's here. And if we don't get down to 1.5, we're gone. And it's not just us. We keep talking about human life may end. No, we are all related. And we have to rethink who we are spiritually in order to survive on this planet. And the wonder is, and the gift is, that there are indigenous people who have thousands of years of history to guide us. They're my mentors. This is who I listen to. This is who I learn from. This is who I see the path forward to the survival of life on the planet and following them. Not only do we need to think our spirituality, we need to rethink the way we think. The either or, good, bad, God, devil, heaven, hell, binary thought is wrong. It's both and. So I've just given you a literal, linear lecture, right? I said 19th century was personhood, 20th century was equality, 21st century is transformation. But it's both and, isn't it? I mean, the vision of transformation goes back to the 19th century at least and before. And guess what, folks? We still don't have personhood. Until we have absolute control of our bodies, we are not persons. We don't own who we are. In the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we are not sovereigns of our own bodies. And we don't have equality. We don't have equal rights protected yet in the Constitution, even though it was introduced in 1923. Now, I gotta tell you, it is not comfortable hanging out with these dead feminists because they are just after me constantly with, why are you allowing these things to continue? So I pass that on to you and challenge us all. We can't allow these injustices to continue. John Mohawk, who is a Seneca scholar and one of my mentors, he's since passed, but his writings are just so instructive. And John said, peace is not the absence of violence, it is the presence of justice. And that is what we must work for. We're on the edge of destruction in a way that the world has never been. And we can't go into there's no way forward, but we can't keep doing what we're doing. And the wonder and the gift is that there are people who have 1,000-year or longer knowledge of how to live in balance and harmony with all life on this planet and with Mother Earth. And we've got to. There is no other way forward. If there is to survive life on this planet, we have to learn from indigenous people. Thank you. Thank you. And now, I'm really eager to hear your thoughts, your comments, your questions.
Just two things real quick here. We're going to have a question and answer session. There's a microphone. Shane has it, so if you'd raise your hand, Shane will approach you. And if you could state your question as succinctly and clearly as you can. The second thing I want to say is, if you may have noticed coming in, there are books at the back here, and when we're done with the question and answer session, Sally has very graciously agreed to sign books. So it's we're getting close to holiday season, so it's a wonderful time to pick up signed copies of a book. So let's hear some questions.
There's one up here, Shane.
Hello? Okay, thank you. I just first wanted to say thank you for that lecture. That was so fascinating. And I was very curious, in Indiana, from what I was taught growing up here in an elementary school, we have very little connection to the indigenous peoples who used to have lived here. It's kind of spoken like, well, the Trail of Tears happened and they all went away and there's nobody left to ask. And so I was really interested in looking at indigenous people the way you're discussing, to tie it back to American history and to tie it back to today and change. So where would you recommend people begin to look for those resources if they don't know where they already are in their community?
Did you want to? I have to confess something. I went to a whole lot of rock concerts in the 60s. They were so worth it. Everybody from Jefferson Airplane to, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. I mean, but the problem was I stood really close to the sound systems. They warned us, but I have trouble hearing, and I have learned to read lips, and you know what it's like for somebody who reads lips with everybody masked in front of you? It's not easy. So we may do mic check here, huh?
Yeah, so the question was basically, Catherine, if you wanted to begin investigating and learning about Indigenous culture, maybe in a place like southern Indiana where we're not exposed to it a ton, how would you best go about that? Did that capture it? Okay.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Are there any powwows nearby? That any events that Native people there are powwows nearby. That's a great place to go and hang out and eat fry bread and begin to get a feel. One of the things that I consider myself a recovering racist. It's one day at a time, and it's recognizing how my white privilege just comes out, and that sort of sense of superiority constantly. And I'm just, it's a constant battle. But one of the things that I find is that when I'm in a situation where I'm in the minority, I get nervous. And guess what I do when I get nervous? I start talking. Just talking. My friend Tilly Black Bear, we did the Bigfoot ride in South Dakota. It's the trail that led to Wounded Knee, the massacre, and it's done yearly. And we did it together one year, and I was writing in my journal, and Tilly said, "What'd you write?" And I said, I think Tilly thinks I talk too much. Is that true? And Tilly said, yeah, it is. And it was what I realized was that when my mom got mad, she did the silent treatment. And so absence of words and a silence can be really anxiety producing for me. Where Tilly comes from a culture, she's Sichungu Lakota, and she comes from a culture in which you just don't throw a whole lot of words out into the air. If you're going to put some out, they need to mean something. And so one of the things I have to do when I'm in an indigenous situation is to curb my enthusiasm, and just sort of try to be comfortable with my discomfort at being in a situation where I don't really know what I should be doing, and I don't really know what. But I think, kind of hanging out in taking up opportunities to hear, to be in the presence of, go on the internet and you can get educated beyond belief. There's so many good things. The Thanksgiving address, for example, I'll just give you one tiny example. The Thanksgiving address begins all Haudenosaunee ceremonies and meetings, and it's giving thanks to all life. And it's really a wonderful recognition of how we are all related. So the Thanksgiving begins with thanking Mother Earth, and now our minds are one, and you all agree. And then you go through the trees, and you go through all the animals, and it can take a very long time, but it orients you. You know, imagine starting meetings with a recognition of who we are in our relationship with all of life. You deal in different ways when you do that. So I think, and there's all kinds of, if you just Google Thanksgiving address, Iroquois or Haudenosaunee, you find all kinds of examples of that. So, you know, it's hidden in plain sight, I think. But it feels like, where is it? Where do I go? So good question, thank you. Good luck with that too. I think you're already on the path, so I get that feeling.
So my question was, when was the Women's Suffrage Union first founded? I was just wondering.
Oh, that's a good question. When was the women's suffrage movement first founded? I wish I could give you a really quick answer of that, but you know what? You could change the history that we know, and I'll tell you how. The first meeting that we acknowledge was held in Seneca Falls in 1848. Was that the first actual, it was local, but was that the first actual meeting? I'll tell you what my fantasy is. A sixth grader or a history student in Evansville is going to go into the newspaper and find a women's rights convention that happened before July 1848. You know, history is a verb. It's not a noun. History is a process of rethinking how we understand our past, telling different stories, telling more inclusive stories. But once we start that process, what we know about who we are and our past is transformed. And we know that now as voices that have been silenced. And when I was in grade school, you know, during the dark ages, it was all white. It was all dominant culture. And that is not the experience, and hopefully will continue not to be the experience, although we know that there's threats to that today, to go back to the whole white supremacist way of teaching history. But we have the knowledge of a much wider and broader history. So, you know, maybe some of the things that I've told you here will be dated as the history students on this campus begin to, you know, question and look at it and find deeper information. So. You're getting to your exercise, Sean.
Hi.
Hi.
All of your work and research and everything you just spoke about is so impressive and so important and daunting and overwhelming. And I guess my question is just like, how are you not in the fetal position panicking at any moment? And like, how do you find the strength and the ambition to keep being an activist and making change and creating a better world?
You know, I think as a radical feminist, when we wanted to change the institutions in the late 60s, early 70s, the vision we had was, if we can make a dent in these institutions, if we can change them even a little bit, we'll create new human beings. And the students that I teach, and the students that James has the honor of teaching, you are the new human beings that we created. you see a different world, you understand the world in a different way, and you're my mentors. And how can you not be an optimist when Greta is blah, blah, blahing? You know, when the students are saying, I'm calling BS on this, I'm calling BS on this. You know, there's a cutting to the chase of truth that young people are modeling today that inspires me. And, you know, to be hopeless is to let the enemy win. And to be hopeful is you just keep kicking ass, you just keep moving forward, you just keep keeping on. So, yeah.
Perfect. I think we've got one more question down here, Shane, and then I think we'll call it a day after that.
And I'll be delighted to chat with you afterwards, too.
My question is, do you think our generation is doing a good job to protect the women's rights and all the rights?
That's an important question. Can you help me with that? Thank you.
So the question was, do you think our generation is doing, and I hasten to add her generation, not my generation, is doing enough to protect women's rights and all the rights?
I don't know how much you should be doing. You're the one to decide that. But one of the things that I worry about is the lack of information. My students at Syracuse University and their honor students don't realize that they are likely to lose the right to control their own bodies by January. The Supreme Court is going to hear they're going to hear the Mississippi case, and that's going to be the big one that will decide whether Roe v. Wade remains the law of the land. And I think educating the one thing I would recommend, but you have to decide how and what to do, but understanding what the issues are right now is a tough one, and just having a sense of them. The outrage that follows is the fuel that will drive you. I think drives all of us, yeah. So thank you again. I really appreciate the honor of being here. Thank you. So, see you at the back.
Yeah, so you can actually get in line if you want to purchase books. You can actually go ahead and purchase them, and we'll make our way to the back, and we will be there momentarily.